Something about that fourth down play didn't just look bad. It felt wrong. Not blown coverage wrong, not he got beat wrong. It was the kind of moment that makes you rewind the clip, squint at the screen, and ask yourself whether what you just saw actually happened. Because at the highest level of football, effort is supposed to be the one thing you never have to question. And yet, that's exactly what fans are questioning right now. Within minutes, the footage was everywhere. Timelines flooded, group chats lit up. Former players, analysts, and everyday fans all zeroed in on the same detail. A quarterback standing in the pocket with everything on the line and protection that seemed to evaporate without resistance. No scramble, no chance, just immediate pressure and a drive-ending hit. In the uncomfortable part, it didn't look accidental. That moment didn't just spark outrage, it reopened conversations that never really went away. Conversations about whether Shedeur Sanders is being evaluated fairly, about whether the environment around him is actually designed for success, and about whether what we're watching is simply poor execution or something more troubling that keeps repeating in different forms. Because when something like this happens once, it's a mistake. When it keeps happening, people start looking for patterns. Fans started connecting dots, not just to that play, but to earlier decisions, strange rotations, missed chemistry, and situations that seemed to put Sanders at a disadvantage long before the ball was ever snapped. And that's why this story matters, not because of one fourth down, not because of one lineman, but because that single clip may have exposed a much bigger issue, one that could shape how Shedeur Sanders' entire NFL future is remembered. And once you see how this all started, that play won't feel random at all. Fourth and short. No room for excuses, no margin for hesitation. This is the kind of moment players dream about, the kind that defines seasons and exposes weaknesses instantly. The crowd knew it, the defense knew it, and most importantly, the offense knew exactly what was at stake. One conversion keeps hope alive, one failure ends the drive. The ball is snapped, and for a split second, everything looks normal. Shedeur Sanders drops back, eyes downfield, shoulders squared. But almost immediately, something feels off. Pressure doesn't creep in, it explodes straight through. Not from a perfectly timed blitz, not from a dominant pass rusher winning his matchup. It comes clean, fast, and untouched. As the replay rolls, fans notice what made the clip go viral. On the edge of the line, a 300-pound lineman barely moves. No punch, no engagement, no attempt to redirect the rush. He doesn't get overpowered or out-techniqued. He simply isn't there. The defender walks through like the play was drawn that way. Sanders never has a chance. He's hit almost as soon as he plants his foot. Fourth down fails. Drive over. And the reaction is immediate. People aren't arguing scheme or play design. They're asking how a breakdown that obvious happens on one of the most important snaps of the game. Slow motion only makes it worse. The body language stands out. The lack of urgency stands out. This isn't what fans are used to seeing when a lineman gets beat. Usually there's a recovery step, a grab, something, anything that shows resistance. Here, there's silence where effort should be. Within hours, the clip is everywhere. Analysts pause it frame by frame. Fans compare it to other blown blocks around the league. And the consensus keeps circling back to the same word, not as an accusation, but as a question. How does something like this happen? And more importantly, why did it look so intentional? But that question didn't come from this play alone. It came from everything that led up to it. What made this play so unsettling wasn't just the result, it was how unfamiliar it looked. In the NFL, linemen get beat all the time. Elite pass rushers win. Schemes break down. Feet get crossed. Hands miss their mark. But even in those moments, there's urgency. There's a scramble to recover. There's visible effort to at least slow the damage. That's why this clip hit differently. There was no recovery step, no late shove, no reach, no grab, no attempt to even redirect the defender's path. The lineman didn't lose leverage, he never tried to establish it. And when contact finally happened, it looked more like a gentle nudge than a professional collision between two 300-pound athletes. Fans weren't calling it out because Sanders got hit. Quarterbacks get hit. They were reacting to the absence of resistance, the kind that almost never happens by accident at this level. This wasn't a missed assignment where the defender fooled someone. This wasn't a stunt that caught the line off guard. It was one-on-one, right in front of the play, and it ended before it even started. Former players and film watchers started pointing to the same details: the stance, the timing, the lack of hand placement. Even the body language afterward felt off. No frustration, no immediate reaction, just a quiet reset like the outcome was expected. That's when the conversation shifted, not into accusations, but into speculation. People began asking whether this was just one ugly rep or another example of something that's been quietly building. Because when effort becomes the question instead of execution, it changes how everything else is viewed. And once fans started looking backwards instead of just at that single snap, the pattern they thought they saw made the play feel a lot less random. Long before that fourth down snap ever happened, fans were already uneasy about how Shedeur Sanders was being handled. It started quietly, the kind of thing you only notice if you're paying close attention. Reports coming out of training camp suggested Sanders wasn't getting the same kind of consistent first-team reps that young quarterbacks usually need. While other quarterbacks were building rhythm with their starters, his work felt separate. Instead of developing timing with the main receiving group or getting comfortable behind the starting offensive line, Sanders was often seen working on side fields or throwing to mixed units. On paper, that might not sound alarming. Coaches rotate reps all the time, but development at quarterback is fragile. Chemistry isn't something you flip on in September. It's built through repetition, trust, and shared mistakes in August. That's why fans started questioning the logic. How do you evaluate a quarterback fairly if he's not practicing in the same environment he'll be judged in on Sundays? How do you expect clean execution when the pieces around him haven't logged meaningful time together? Those questions didn't come from conspiracy, they came from common sense. As the season unfolded, the effects became harder to ignore. Timing routes looked rushed, protection felt inconsistent, receivers and quarterback didn't always seem on the same page, and instead of looking like isolated issues, it started to feel like the predictable result of limited preparation. To be clear, no one is saying this was done with intent, but intent doesn't change outcome. When a young quarterback enters the season without full chemistry, every mistake gets magnified, every breakdown looks worse, and when things go wrong later, it's easy to forget how early decisions set the stage. Which is why, after that viral play, fans weren't just upset about one missed block, they were remembering how long this story had been quietly building. When the conversation shifts to numbers, that's where context often gets lost. Box scores are clean, film is not. And when people point to Shedeur Sanders' stat line to make their case, they're missing what actually happened between the snaps. Because the tape tells a very different story than the final numbers suggest. Take the interceptions everyone keeps circling. One comes off a pass that's slightly behind the target. Not perfect, but absolutely catchable. The ball hits the receiver's hands, and instead of being secured, it pops up and turns into a turnover. That goes in the stat book as a quarterback mistake, even though any veteran will tell you that's a shared responsibility at worst. Another pick comes off a deflection at the line of scrimmage. A defender gets a hand on the ball, it changes trajectory, and suddenly the play is dead. That happens to quarterbacks across the league every week. It's part of football. But again, the stat sheet doesn't explain that, it just records the outcome. What the film shows is something else entirely. It shows Sanders standing in the pocket under pressure, keeping his eyes downfield, and delivering throws while bodies collapse around him. It shows him moving just enough to avoid the first wave, buying time with subtle footwork rather than panic. And it shows a quarterback trying to execute within structure, not forcing hero plays that lead to disaster. Analysts who broke down the game noticed it too. They pointed out his pocket presence, his balance, and his ability to stay composed against one of the league's toughest defenses. This wasn't a quarterback unraveling. It was one navigating chaos the best way he could. That's why the frustration grows when people judge the performance without watching the film. Because when you do, it becomes clear that not every negative result belongs solely to the quarterback. And once that realization sinks in, attention naturally shifts to what and who was making his job harder. The pressure on a quarterback doesn't come only from the rush. It comes from knowing whether anyone will be there when the ball leaves his hand. And in this game, that uncertainty showed up again and again. Opportunities were there, windows opened, but too often the execution on the other end didn't match the moment. There were throws that should have extended drives, passes placed where only the receiver could make a play. Instead, they turned into incompletions or worse because of late reactions, mistimed routes, or hands that didn't finish the job. Those are the plays that quietly flip momentum, not with a highlight, but with frustration. What stood out most was the contrast. Some targets fought for the ball, attacked it at the catch point, and made themselves available when things broke down. Others seemed to fade into the background. When your quarterback is under constant pressure, reliability becomes everything. And when that reliability isn't there, the offense shrinks. Fans noticed it immediately. They weren't asking for spectacular catches, just routine execution. Secure the ball, finish the play, help your quarterback breathe for a second. But instead, the same pattern repeated. Pressure, throw, missed opportunity, punt, or turnover. That's how narratives form, not from one drop, but from a series of moments where help never quite arrives. And when viewers started pairing those missed chances with the protection issues and the training camp questions, it fueled a growing belief that Sanders wasn't just battling the defense, he was battling circumstances stacked against him. And once that idea takes hold, every snap starts to feel heavier than the last. At some point, it stopped feeling like a one-game issue. The protection problems weren't new, and they weren't subtle. Week after week, pressure showed up faster than it should. Pockets collapsed before routes could develop. Runs died at the line of scrimmage. And eventually, fans stopped asking if the offensive line was struggling. They started asking how bad it really was. This unit wasn't just losing battles, it was losing them quickly, too quickly. Defensive fronts didn't need exotic looks or perfectly timed blitzes. Simple four-man rushes were enough to disrupt everything. That's when frustration turns into suspicion, not because people want drama, but because repeated failures demand an explanation. Some point to scheme, others blame communication, and plenty of fans believe it's simply poor execution. But no matter which explanation you choose, they all lead to the same place, a quarterback being put in survival mode far too often. And when survival becomes the priority, development takes a back seat. That's where the speculation started growing louder. Not accusations, but questions. Why does protection seem to disappear in the biggest moments? Why does effort look inconsistent snap to snap? Why do breakdowns happen in ways that don't resemble typical NFL mistakes? Even analysts who avoid narratives couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Protection issues change how a quarterback sees the field. They rush mechanics. They force early decisions. And over time, they shape public perception, especially for a young player still trying to establish his identity in the league. Which is why that fourth down clip hit so hard. It didn't feel like an outlier. It felt like the moment everything people had been uneasy about finally became impossible to ignore. When problems stretch across an entire season, the spotlight eventually shifts upward. Players execute, but coaches set the tone. They decide who gets reps, who earns trust, and what gets corrected or ignored. And as frustration builds, fans naturally start asking whether accountability is being applied evenly. That's where much of the tension around Shedeur Sanders really sits, not in any single play, but in how quickly blame seems to find him compared to others. Mistakes by the quarterback are magnified, breakdowns around him are explained away, And over time, that imbalance shapes perception, both inside and outside the locker room. Coaching isn't just about play calling, it's about confidence. Young quarterbacks need structure, consistency, and clear belief from the staff. When those signals feel mixed, it creates hesitation. When trust feels conditional, players start pressing. And when that happens, development stalls. Fans aren't demanding perfection, they're asking for fairness. They want to know whether Sanders is being given the same margin for error that other young quarterbacks receive across the league, whether mistakes are being coached or simply cataloged, whether the plan is truly long-term or just survival week to week. That's the bigger question hanging over all of this, because if the environment doesn't change, neither will the outcome. And if a quarterback fails in a situation that never supported him properly, the league won't remember the details, only the result. And that's exactly what worries people most as this story continues to unfold. That fourth down play will probably live on as a short clip, replayed, paused, debated, and eventually absorbed into the endless cycle of NFL highlights. But its real meaning goes far beyond a single snap. It became a symbol, not proof of anything definitive, but a moment that forced people to stop and reassess everything they thought they were watching. For Shedeur Sanders, moments like this are dangerous, not because they define his ability, but because the league is unforgiving when it comes to narratives. Context fades quickly, development timelines get ignored, and once a label sticks, it's hard to peel off, no matter how unfair it may be. This isn't about claiming sabotage as fact, it's about perception, patterns in the environment surrounding a young quarterback still trying to find solid ground. When protection breaks down, chemistry looks rushed, and accountability feels uneven. Even normal mistakes start to look suspicious, and fans notice. The uncomfortable truth is that careers are shaped just as much by circumstance as talent. A different system, a different structure, a different level of support can change everything. That's why this moment matters, not for what it proves, but for what it asks. Because the real question isn't whether that one play was intentional. The real question is whether Shedeur Sanders is being given a genuine chance to succeed. And until that answer feels clear, every snap will be viewed through a much sharper lens than it ever should be.